Welcome to the first episode of HolzChat.
We hope you're all well, healthy, and comfortable, and that you will enjoy the next 65 to 70 minutes with us.
We are Ilka and Steve, founders of Holzraum System. Holzraum System specializes in high-performance wooden building envelope design and translation for off-site manufacturing. Please check out our site for more information.
Thank you for joining us in this new endeavor of asking really smart people a lot of questions about wood. In this episode, our first ever, our guests will be answering questions like why wood, how is it sustainable, and how does sustainable forestry work? One of the things that we'll also be talking about is the potential of the abundance of small diameter timber that is grown here in the US, and how to increase its value as building materials when they're incorporated into future building systems.
We hope you enjoy this pre-recorded 55-minute session followed by a live chat where you can ask our guest questions. Please place your questions in the Q&A section and technical questions or comments in the chat section. Should we start the show?
Let's start the show.
All right, so for our first episode ever, we thought what better place to start than to explore what sustainable forestry really means. Our chat partners today live, work, and breathe sustainable forestry and the building products it produces. As the Lands and Resources Manager of F.H. Stoltz Land and Lumber Company, Paul McKenzie is tasked with oversight of 3 professional foresters and is responsible for all aspects of land management on the company's 39,000-acre tree farm, as well as sourcing fiber for their sawmill and cogeneration facility. A 1992 graduate of the University of New Hampshire with a bachelor's in forest management, Paul's practiced forestry for a variety of private industry and agency organizations in locations ranging from New England to Alaska. Pat Clark is our other guest, is a 3rd-generation builder with 25 years of wood processing and heavy timber construction experience. For the past 10 years, he's focused his research, networking, and business model around mass timber. Pat designed and constructed the first CLT building in the US and is acting president and co-founder of Stoltz Timber Systems, a Montana-based firm bringing European mass timber technology and products to architects and builders in North America.
Okay, hi Paul and hi Pat. We're super excited that we are able to ask you a bunch of questions today. And I just want to start with just wooden assemblies that we as Holzraum are very committed to. Since the beginning, since we started, we just wanted to use assemblies that are foam-free and mainly consist of wood-based materials. And we always have to answer the question to people like, why wood? And we're actually very excited that we can ask you the same question right now. So Paul, why wood?
Well, thanks, Ilka, and thanks for the opportunity to spend a little time with you folks this morning to answer that question. And that's really what we're going to do for the next 30 minutes. For us, we understand that folks that are designing projects and managing projects have a lot of choices out there, a lot of choices about different building materials. And it really comes down to balance and understanding the pros and cons, because there are pros and cons to everything. For us, wood is a natural choice. It's renewable. It has connection to our natural world and our local communities. And for our company, F.H. Stoltz Land and Lumber and Company, we've been in business since 1912. There aren't too many family-owned companies that have been around that long. And I think the reason we've been so successful for that period of time is this mission statement you see on your screen. In the background, you see a picture of our mill in 1923 when it first started operations. We've come a long ways since then. But this idea of stewardship and meeting the needs of today without compromising the ability of future generations to do so is really important, and it really ties in nicely with forests. We have a saying we like to use here at Stolz, and that's healthy forests make for healthy families and healthy communities. And that's really the reason why you should be using wood products, because there's more to it than a lot of other materials out there. And that connection between our natural world and our communities is really important, and it really ties together that idea of stewardship. And I think it's the concept that many of you folks are trying to build into your projects as well. So Steve, if you want to show that little clip we have from the tree farm, that'd be great. It kind of gives a snapshot of what we're doing here at Stolz.
Plants are part of the American Tree Farm System and have been certified through that program since 1964 and continue to be certified today. And so that's the basis of how we built our management plan for this conservation easement. We have about 40,000 acres of timberland that we own and manage. We operate a sawmill and a cogeneration facility that produces electricity and steam. We produce about 60 million board feet a year of lumber. We employ 120 people, and those are good family-raising jobs. Our little company puts about $25 to $30 million a year worth of spending into our local economy.
Thanks, Paul, for sharing this. What's kind of interesting is that, so I grew up in Germany, and I actually grew up right next to a big piece of woods. And, you know, looking out my window, I could definitely follow that there was a plan on how to manage this forest. And I do know that the occupation of being a forest manager is taken very, very seriously. So what I never really understood or you know, got into is how does it actually really work to manage a forest like that. So could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, I'd be glad to. You know, it's interesting. We really do a pretty poor job in the United States about talking about forestry. You know, you think about farming and everybody knows what a farmer is and what they do, but people really don't think about the forest and what's going on around them there. So, you know, silviculture is kind of the technical term about forestry. And silviculture is about growing trees. It's the science about growing trees, but forestry is more, it's on the bigger scale. And it's really about growing the trees, but it's also about considering all the other things that go on in our forest as well. The social side of things like visuals, wildlife habitat, all that kind of stuff is really things that forest managers and foresters in the United States spend a lot of time thinking about. I often say to folks, you know, quite honestly, the trees are the easy part. There's a lot of science, you know, about forestry and about growing trees, and I don't want to downplay the importance of silviculture and the scientific aspect of that, but the reality is trying to fit forestry into the bigger picture is pretty important. As foresters, you know, we're working on rotations of periods of time between harvested trees or planting of trees that are 25 to 70 years long. So for us, we have to have a really long-term view of the world. And it's all about really two steps in forestry. It's about establishing new trees or getting trees growing. And then what do you do afterwards? You know, in forest management, it's pretty much about managing spacing of trees. You know, trees need a few things to grow, and one of them is space. And so that's the snapshot. It's not a whole lot different than farming, other than you're doing it on a very long time frame, and you're doing it in areas that people don't even realize that you're doing it. So so really focus on that, you know, establishing trees and then tending trees, and that's talking about removing trees and managing spacing. That's really what forestry is about. And some of the products of forest management that you'll find out there, and you can see it on the screen here with the Certified Tree Farm System sign. It's wood, water, recreation, and wildlife. Those are all things that come out of our forest. There aren't very many landowners in the United States that are just focusing on producing wood products and nothing else. Wood products is one of the benefits of active forest management, but it's not generally the #1 goal. And so that's kind of what's so neat about forestry, is it produces a lot of things that people don't even think about.
So Paul, if we're looking at all these different products and we're talking about using wood as a building material, there's always a question that comes up that is, so if we start cutting down all these trees because all of a sudden, you know, we're promoting to use wood for all these different building materials, would that have a negative impact?
Sure, that's always the first question we get is, you know, what happens after you cut down the trees? And you think about it, wood is really the only building product we have that's renewable. And believe it or not, we actually, as forest managers, one of the challenges we have in most everywhere in the United States is we have too many trees, not that we don't have enough trees. There's a lot of statistics out there that will show you how many more trees we have today than 100 years ago. But even if you look on a very small local scale, it's really about managing that spacing. These darn trees keep growing. And that's kind of the funny thing about it, is that, you know, given the things that they need, which is basically an undisturbed landscape, if they have the opportunity, they're going to continue to grow. You know, I talked earlier about tending, and I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but this is just a wood cookie that's two different slices of a tree that came from the same species of tree, but in different locations. And if you remember when you were a little kid, you probably learned that you can tell how old the tree is by counting the rings. You can see at this tree on this side, it's about 15 years old, 12 years old. Or a tree of the same size is 52 years old on the other side. And it really comes back down to whether or not it has the important stuff to grow a tree. It takes three things to grow trees: sunlight, water, and nutrients. And if the tree has those things, it's going to grow. What we have to remember is that our forests aren't static. Our forests are changing every day. And in this next slide here, it just kind of shows this whole concept of succession. And really the important thing is that we keep the land underneath our forest as growing trees and forestry. And that's the focus. And what forest management does is try to emulate the natural processes. So keeping that in mind, you can't take a forest that you know today and put it in a box, put it on a shelf, come back in 50 years and have it be the same. If you look in these upper screens here, this is the classic succession pictures, you know, where it starts off with these small trees and then different species and complexities come into the forest. But that's what forests do naturally. Forest management tries to emulate that as well. But like I said before, what's unusual about forestry that people don't even recognize is it's happening in their backyard and they may not even realize it unless there's actually a timber harvest going on. And what's unique about forest management is that it's a forest before and after we do the forest management. You know, if you talk to folks about natural events that happen in our forest every day, whether it be a windstorm or maybe a forest fire or an insect and disease outbreak, if you ask them, is that a forest before and after that event? They're going to say yes. And the same thing with the timber harvest, you know, and that timber harvest is just another event that takes place in the natural succession of forest management. That is just like a natural one, only you have a little more control over it. You know, with forest management, like we say, we don't see forest management get out of control like we see wildfires in the West. You know, if we plan on managing 25 acres, and we're going to manage 25 acres, and you don't always have that control of natural processes. So renewability, these darn forests are going to keep growing if you give them the opportunity to do so. And the benefit is we get our forest products out of that you folks can use in your building projects in conjunction with the natural processes that happen.
So Paul, I'm starting to really understand the process a little better, but how is this really sustainable?
You know, that's a great question. You know, like I said before, the good news is that trees keep on going, but really the biggest threat or challenge to forest management in the United States especially is not bad forestry. It's really loss of forested acres, right? And that takes place through conversion to other uses. So the first thing we can do to ensure sustainability is to make sure that we keep those lands as forest lands. You know, it's really important to remember that there's somebody that owns each one of these acres up there. You know, like I say, that the sustainability from the trees being there, it's really not the huge issue. And some data from Montana, you know, This is just on our national forest lands, which is about 60% of our forested land in the state of Montana. We grow 567 million cubic feet of wood fiber every year, no matter what happens. That's the equivalent to a block of wood that's the size of a football field and 2 miles tall. Or if you were to line up log trucks, there's 230,000 log trucks that reach from here in Northwest Montana all the way to Boston. That's growing out in our forest lands every year. So as long as we keep those lands as forest land, the trees are going to keep doing their job and growing. And we also have to remember that the trees are dying out there. Mother Nature is still doing her thing. If we don't do active forest management, then she's going to make the natural processes take place that ensure that her forests are healthy into the future. And so just some figures there, 510 million cubic feet of mortality every year in Montana, yet we're only removing 26 million feet. So sustainability is really not based on whether or not we're cutting too many trees. As long as we keep those acres as forestry, or as in forest, that's going to be important. Remember, these forests are not static. Mother Nature's doing her thing. You can see in these photos like this, we have insect disease outbreaks that are taking place across the state of Montana and all throughout the West. That's just Mother Nature doing her thing and thinning those forests and trying to keep them healthy. Great slide that it shows in graphical form, the growth of mortality compared to the actual removals, which is just a small percentage. And this is really true in most of our states across the United States. We've got great laws in place that ensure things like water quality are maintained, that wildlife habitat are maintained. It's really unique in that in the world, people use about 3.3 pounds of wood fiber every day. In the United States, we use about 3 times that amount. And so going back to our earlier question, why wood? It's about choices. And why not take our wood from sustainably managed forests that are done in the United States under great systems of certification and legal ramifications that make sure we do it right. But this is one of the options we have, especially in western Montana. Mother Nature will take over and manage these forests for us. Why not do it in a manner that allows us to meet the demands of society at the same time? So Steve, the other thing we got to remember is that these forest lands are owned by somebody, right? And if you look at the nationwide picture of our forests, about 38% of those lands are owned by just private forest landowners. There's folks that may own 40 acres or 120 acres. It might be their family inheritance. But if they don't have a reason to continue to own and manage that land, that's really what threatens sustainability of our forestry moving ahead. In the West, preponderance of the acres are owned by federal. Forest Service owns 60% of the forest lands in Montana. But the ones that are really in most concern is these private forest lands. And one of the things that active forest management does is it provides a revenue stream that helps justify those family forest lands as staying forest lands too. So that's another important part. Once again, the trees are going to keep growing, but if we don't have the forest land as forest land, that's the really major threat to sustainability.
Okay, so Paul, when Ilka and I first started looking at the Holzraum, what kind of assemblies and projects we wanted to do, we started to really analyze the embodied carbon of the different options that we had. And we realized pretty quickly when we started running life cycle analysis that if you don't have something to assure that the lumber in the building was really sustainably sourced and managed, then you can't really claim credit for that carbon sequestration and all the benefits of a wooden building for low carbon. So how, and now it's really interesting because you're talking about 38% of these forests. That's a huge bit of these forests are actually owned by private owners. How do we trust these, whether they're private or public or commercial? How do we trust these people? How do we know that these are really sustainably, sourced materials?
Steve, that's a great question. And for years, I'd say, well, just trust me, right? It's interesting here locally, like for example, Pat, he has the opportunity to go out and, take his dog for a walk on our company lands, and he gets to see our forest management out on the ground. And so we have to kind of prove to him one-on-one that we're actually doing what we say we're doing. We realize we can't do that for all of our customers. And so you know, about 25 years ago, this whole concept of forest certification came out, and it's really this: it's being able to tie the end product, the piece of lumber or the mass timber product that you have, back to knowing that good forest management took place on the ground. And there's a couple different programs out here that are around the, especially you have Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or SFI. You have the FSC, or the Forest Stewardship Council. You have the American Tree Farm System. Those are all third-party certification systems that are very structured. Members of those systems can actually make the claim, yes, my lumber is green, for lack of a better term. Okay, and there's a lot of work that goes into that. It goes back to having a system in place, a system of rules and regulations internally for us as a company. And then we have annual audits that are done by a third party that comes in and says, okay, you say that you're going to do this, you're going to regenerate within 5 years. We want to go out on the ground and show us where you've done that. Show us your records that prove to us that you're doing that. And so that's really the embodiment of forest certification, is having that third party coming out, getting out on the ground, and then signing off on that and saying, yes, these folks are actually doing what they're doing out there. You know, there's a lot of laws and regulations across the United States to ensure forest management is done correctly. That's another way to ensure it. You know, just making sure that we're following the rules and regulations, and that's the role that forest certification can do. And we think that has some value. We haven't seen that necessarily reflected in the marketplace, but I think through this secondary manufacturing, asking these questions about forestry will generate that value for the future.
And of course, that chain of custody needs to be continued past, you know, the sourcing and the lumber. It has to be followed all the way through to the end user for it to meet a lot of those certifications.
Correct. You know, if you just look at this progression that I have on the screen before you, it starts off with a certified forest, and that might be the American Tree Farm System certifying the landowners doing good forestry on the ground. And then the sawmill has fiber sourcing policies to ensure that rules and regulations are followed. You know, it goes through our manufacturing facility, and, you know, we have rules in place to ensure that we're meeting all social and labor laws. Then we have a product of certified lumber, but then those go on to secondary manufacturers that have that another certification process that follows all the way through their system as well.
I think we need to ask Paul about how this really works with carbon, Ilka. You know, I mean, we are constantly talking about carbon sequestration. We all have a pretty good understanding of it, but I would really love to hear how this is helping the carbon fight from a forester's perspective.
Well, what's also interesting is, you know, I've heard that certain growth of trees, you know, have different impacts as, you know, being carbon sponges, so to speak. Is that something that you control as well?
Yeah, boy, the carbon issue, that's a sticky one. Just because there's a lot of different ways to measure things. And I guess maybe just take it back to the basics when we start thinking about carbon in making your trade-off and choices there. And you know, it's one of the unique things about forestry and forest management is that everything we do is really working in what we call the active carbon cycle. So above ground, right? And so we're not extracting sequestered carbon in the form of fossil fuels when we grow trees. You think back to your 5th grade biology, we all kind of know that through photosynthesis, you know, carbon dioxide is absorbed through the leaves, and that becomes the building block for the tree itself, right? So you add some sunlight to that, and you end up taking that carbon dioxide, building a tree out of it, and then emitting oxygen. And so, I mean, that's just the very most basic discussion about carbon, is just think about the active carbon cycle and how trees actually respond to that. You know, and then the difficult part of it is when you start talking about accounting for carbon. And there's lots of different ways to account for carbon out there. We have carbon markets for forestry, but they're not well developed yet. But you think about it just from a choice standpoint, you know, there's no disputing the fact that trees absorb carbon when they grow. And that's pretty simple. About 40% of it ends up sequestered, at least through the life of the tree, in the trunk of the branches. But so about 1% of the carbon in the leaves. There's a lot of it in tree roots. Okay, and so all that carbon is being absorbed from our atmosphere into our forest products, and that's really the only building material that you can say that's true for. Maybe some fiber, some hemp fiber type systems have similar types of characteristics, but really trees are the only one that actually actively absorb carbon. So we look at how that works in the carbon cycle, and there are certainly some fossil fuels that are involved in the harvesting and manufacture and transportation. But at the end of the day, the actual building product itself is part of the atmospheric carbon cycle, and it's a net absorber of carbon. And so the question then becomes, what happens after that tree gets to the end of its life? And that's where the accounting comes in. And like I say, there's lots of different ways to do that. We could spend all day talking and arguing about how to account for the carbon. But if you think about it, if a tree in the forest is grown to its natural old age and it dies, it immediately becomes a carbon emitter. Once decomposition starts, Mother Nature is going to break that tree back down into its elemental parts, and part of that is going to be releasing some carbon back into the atmosphere. If we take that same tree and take part of it and turn it into a durable wood product that turns into a home, or turns into a packaging material, that's going to extend that sequestration at least for the life of whatever that structure that you're going to put it into is. I grew up in New England, and there's a lot of textile mills back there that have wood that was put into it back in the 1800s, and it's still sequestered. There was a picture earlier on of a home that was built in the 1600s. That's carbon that's sequestered for that period of time, that if that tree had not been utilized for that durable wood use, that carbon would have been released right back into the atmosphere. So that's kind of the very simple version of carbon. Maybe it doesn't answer your question as far as how you account balance for carbon, but there's no doubt that forest management and renewable, sustainable forest management is a good way to be a beneficial method to balance this carbon cycle we have that we're dealing with today.
So you're explaining how the forest management is definitely having major positive impacts on carbon. How can the mass timber, one of the big products coming out of European technology in buildings is mass timber. What can mass timber do for forestry, like in North American forests? How can, we're going to kind of switch the conversation a little bit, and I'm just interested to see, Stoltz Timber, who Pat represents, is connected to FH Stoltz, and this is just an interesting, piece as to what can mass timber, kind of a new product in the U.S. and North America in general, what can that do for a forest, for a forester, and for a mill, and for an owner of forests?
Steve, that's a great question. It kind of ties right back into that discussion we had earlier about sustainability. One of the challenges we have is that, in order to keep forest land as forest, it has to be economically viable. Traditionally here in Northwest Montana, our wood products have gone into commodity markets, and everyone knows what that looks like from an economic standpoint. And really, the economics of forestry are something we need to spend a little time thinking about. And it comes back to, how do we generate enough value for the fiber in order to keep the forest land in high quality, sustainable forest management? And that's what mass timber really allows us to do. So you can see the market, the roller coasters that we deal with in the wood products market, the traditional commodity market, they're all over the place. In Montana, we've seen some unusual things. So this is just a graph that shows the last 20 years or so of Doug fir product values coming out, and you'll see an overall trend there in real numbers. But when you start adjusting for inflation, believe it or not, wood is actually getting cheaper. The value of the wood product is getting less valuable. And so how do we continue to bear all the costs that go into good forest management, high quality manufacturing, when we have wood values that are actually getting less valuable. And that's where the mass timber element comes into it, is it actually provides the opportunity to add some more value to that fiber. We really need to be able to generate the value that our trees in Montana or United States are really worth. There's some places in the US where we can grow trees really fast and do it at low cost. And those are great places to produce low value wood products. But some places we have really high quality wood, and being able to differentiate that wood and generate the value that comes along with that is really what mass timber brings to the discussion.
Pat, can you talk a little bit about this this idea that Paul's talking about with adding value to the fiber? This is something that you guys said to me and Ilka a while back ago, and it's really got me thinking like crazy. I never really thought about it that way, but talk to me a little bit more about what that means, and then how does that connect what you're doing with Stultz Timber, that European model? If you could kind of just elaborate on that.
Sure. So, the general idea to sort of tag on to the end of where Paul was going there with the fact, like this graph here shows that we're seeing the value of timber products actually decreasing, which means the foresters have less revenue coming in, and you could even say maybe erratic revenue, because they're really not in control of the value of their own timber, which is kind of a foreign concept. They own the timberlands, they own the trees that grow on those timberlands, but they as owners do not set the value of their timber product. And that is the nature of this commodity problem that foresters and forest landowners have. And so the idea with mass timber is, rather than getting caught in this sort of endless cycle of the ebbs and flows of the commodity pricing, we as mass timber producers, our goal is to add as much value to that timber product as we possibly can. And that means that we're setting our own prices. So we're not tied to a commodity index pricing. We're setting the pricing based on what we think is the market value for our products. Some of that is based on maybe the strength of our timber or the different varieties of products that we blend together to make buildings. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is establish what we call a wood campus. And the wood campus concept is really giving the trees a place to come to in what we call biophilic manufacturing. So it means that the process to manufacture these buildings is a symbiotic relationship with the forests that they come from. So we're managing the forests for the best growth in the current situation. And then we're bringing these trees to the wood campus. And at the wood campus, we're extracting value from each and every component of the tree. And that is the bark going to, say, the biomass, cogeneration, and looking at each individual part of the tree and assessing its highest strength or its highest aesthetic value, and placing that individual timber component into the correct product mix for making the building. And having a blend of products to divert that individual part of the tree to gives us the ability to make small amounts of profit off of each part of the tree, so that at the end of the process, we're not trying to maybe make pennies off of, say, a commodity piece of lumber, but adding extra value to each individual component of the tree. And then the end result is very high value timber products that have high strength characteristics and high aesthetic characteristics as well as an option. And the end result of all of that process is our waste product is energy in the form of steam, which would generate, turn a turbine to make power, and heat is the other waste component that we can utilize to heat our buildings and also fire our kilns to dry our lumber, which creates a zero waste manufacturing facility. And all of this is symbiotic with the forest management process that we're trying to achieve.
Ilka, I'm thinking that Helena Van Vliet would love this conversation. She's going to be a guest that's going to be talking about biophilic design in a future episode of HolzChat. And Ilka, when I saw Pat's notes, I saw that biophilic manufacturing, and I loved that. So I called Pat about that, and I said, talk to me more about this biophilic manufacturing. And so he sent me this awesome clip that I'm going to play for you now. Hold on, so I got to cue it up.
Well, in the meanwhile, I actually have one question. So you're talking about high quality and high value wood fiber, or, you know, timber versus low quality. So what's the difference?
That's probably a question for Paul, but I guess let me ask you a question. When you say low quality or low value, those are two different things, really. So we in Western Montana, we have to compete in the marketplace against other regions of our own country and also other countries. Europeans bring timber products into North America. The Canadians bring their timber products down into the USA. And so even though we live in a location where the cost to manage our forests is quite high, and the cost to deliver our timber, our trees to the sawmill is quite high, and our logging costs are also high. Therefore, the timber that comes out of our mill, it has high costs embedded in it, but we have to compete in a marketplace where other producers are producing lower quality products. And I think Paul could probably dive in and explain that a little bit further.
Sure. You know, it's kind of like, you know, being a commodity market, a commodity product. It's kind of like corn. As long as it meets the minimum standards for whatever a bushel of corn is, then it doesn't make any difference where that bushel comes from, right? It's the same thing with our commodity timber markets. That if you have a 2x4 that meets the minimum standards, nobody really cares where it came from, where the story behind that is. They don't honestly even care. You know, it might be stronger than another 2x4 in the same bin, but if it's cheaper, they're going to buy the cheap one. And so, for example, in Montana, our wood grows slow, and that's one of the primary benefits we have. And so the strength properties of the species we have and the conditions that they grow in are generally stronger than maybe a 2x4 that was grown in as a southern yellow pine in 25 years in the south. Yet in the market, there's no differentiation between the two, and that's where the mass timber allows us to actually capitalize on the strength properties, the visual qualities, the differences between that 2x4 that's grown in Montana and the 2x4 that's grown in Georgia. It allows us to differentiate ourselves. There's a lot of reasons why we think that a 2x4 in Montana is better than a 2x4 from Georgia, but it's a matter of putting the right piece of wood in the right use, right? There's a lot of places where that Georgia 2x4 is great and it's cheap and it's what should be used. But there's places where you need a high quality or high quality from a visual standpoint or a strength standpoint. And that's where we want to make sure we get the right product into the right use. That's what mass timber allows us to do.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually where design really kind of blends with those options, right? Because if you're looking at like a mass timber or an engineered wood product, you have the layering and the different layers in the composite are aiming for different strength targets. So that's that totally makes sense to me. Instead of just having a bunch of 2x4s that have all different loads on them throughout a building, but they basically are just designed as a bunch of 2x, you start looking at engineered products like CLT, glue lamp, and those products have the opportunity to sort of deliver the strengths they need in a really cost-effective way. Actually, you could actually reduce the amount of wood you need in the building because you're targeting the purpose of like the fiber, right? So the design, the combination of it sort of allows you guys to really deliver more targeted, fiber for our projects. Should I, Ilka, should I run that clip?
Yeah.
All right, let's see if I can share.
You want to do a little intro to it?
Yes, I do. Hold on a sec. That's a good point. Before I share. So, like I said, Pat sent this clip over because I asked him about the biophilic manufacturing. And what's really interesting is that Ilka spent some time in Germany. And ironically, Pat and I have known each other for a really long time. And when we first met 20 years ago, we actually worked for a company that was doing one of the first CNC heavy timber processing centers in the country. And it was all German software, all German machinery. And so we've kind of had this love affair with what is happening in Germany and Austria as far as heavy timber and wooden design. And then recently, a couple years ago, I was over, toured a bunch of the Styko plants in Poland and felt this thing that Pat was explaining to me. This is back to that whole thing about the biophilic manufacturing. When we toured those plants, and I know Pat's had this experience over there, it's just so different. There's such a connection and a respect for the forest. They're connected in a way that I'm sure FH Stultz has that. But, with these new opportunities and these new, products for you guys, I think I could see us moving more and more towards that. So this clip is just great because I think you kind of get the flavor of that. So let me share this. And this clip is, sorry, one more thing. So this was produced by National Geographic, I think at the cost of Audi. So I like Audis. It's a little bit of a commercial, but it's really cool. And I think it's going to talk about one of the companies that Pat Stultz Timber actually deals with, which is a European CLT producer and other engineered products producer called Binderholz. So this is kind of about Binderholz.
It's clear that Austria has a deep affinity with its forests. My journey takes me along the valley to an innovative biomass plant, which is burning wood to create energy. In theory, this should be a bad thing, but new technology means we can now create clean, sustainable electricity from trees.
You must have such a close relationship with the forests here.
We have 46% of our land is covered with forest. We have a golden rule: don't cut more than is regrowing. Nothing is wasted, so the bark goes to the energy. The timber is being used for construction wood. We actually have more and more wood in the forest, even though we're harvesting so much.
The sawmill has been in Natalie's family for generations.
How do you go from the trees to all of those products?
We are producing intelligent solid wood products. From the sawdust and the chips and the bark, we are producing heat and also eco-electricity.
So you're powering and heating the entire village from here?
Exactly. We call it a CO2 neutral combustion.
What really excites me about this new biomass electricity is its efficiency. The fact that everything is harvested to create energy. There's no waste. Austria has inspired me in so many ways, but I can't help thinking, where do we go from here?
So I feel like I read somewhere in your notes that different trees in different stages sequester different amounts of carbon. When they're smaller, they just kind of absorb more. I don't know if I'm correct, but is that something that ties back to the products?
We could
The small diameter timber stuff,
Yeah.
right?
dovetail the small diameter timber in, and because that was sort of like one of the genesis of Stolz Timber Systems as a joint venture partner with FH Stolz Land and Lumber was, FH Stolz. I was coming to FH Stolz and giving them presentations on what was happening in the mass timber world in North America and how it was transitioning from Europe to North America, and what was translating well from Europe and what wasn't translating well from Europe, and how does that apply to the conditions on our own forests in Montana and in the Northern Rockies region. And to be honest, I wasn't getting a lot of traction with the Stolz guys at FH Stolz, because we had this problem where standard mass timber products, the lamstock or the timber boards that they're utilizing in North America for mass timber production, were really larger planks of timber that we would associate with commodity lumber production, 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, that kind of thing. And sawmills like FH Stolz Land and Lumber, for the most part, that's their bread and butter. Those are the products that they make every day and they make a living from. Of course, we recognize that there's this issue with being tied to commodity lumber production. But the issue really became apparent to me that there's this pivot or transition point for North American sawmills, and how do they transition from being a traditional sawmill based on commodity lumber production into a value-added engineered wood product or mass timber manufacturing facility. And that's a hard transition to make. And the sort of the discovery that we came to, or the light bulb moment for me, was I brought to FH Stolz Timber a sample of a panelized timber product from Europe, from the Czech Republic in particular. And I brought this product in, and it's made of very small pieces of timber, or what we would call scantling timber pieces. I brought this product and I set it on their table, and Chuck and Paul sort of had that moment of, aha, this could be the solution for how we transition from a traditional commodity sawmill producer into a mass timber products producer, because it solves a problem in our forests. And the problem is, we have, as Paul alluded to earlier, we're growing more timber than we're harvesting, and a fairly large percentage of that timber that is growing in the forests is what we call small diameter timber, or non-saw log timber, meaning it's not traditionally utilized by sawmills. And what we recognize is that a lot of that small diameter timber actually has high value because it's growing very slowly in our high alpine forests. It takes a long time to grow, and when it grows slowly, the growth rings on those trees get very dense, and it makes very strong timber, but it doesn't have a market. Those trees do not have a market, because you can't make a 2x4 or a 2x6 or a 2x8 out of a tree that's, only this big. So what we've developed at Stolz Timber Systems is a range of products that we can make panelized construction and also beam products out of, that are high strength products, high aesthetic value products, but at the same time offering FH Stolz Land and Lumber the opportunity to manage this small diameter timber problem by utilizing those small trees, bringing them into the sawmill, processing them, and then handing them over to Stolz Timber Systems, which is the manufacturing arm of this joint venture, and making these high value, high strength products from the small trees.
Paul, what did you think when they approached you, and you guys you saw those products? What were you thinking?
Well, it really kind of close the loop for us, because being a forester, I'm always thinking about the resource and what challenges do I have? What would I like to be able to do that I can't do today? And one of the, like Pat said, we actually have too many trees in our forest. Going back to the basics of forestry, it's thinning and spacing that we need to be doing to keep our trees healthy so that they're growing faster, absorbing more carbon, and being more resilient to insect and disease outbreaks. But finding an outlet, a product that we can make out of this small diameter timber that has enough value to allow us to do the forest management, transportation to get it out of the woods. Right now, the only markets we have for small diameter timber are things like paper fiber or medium density fiberboard, which are great products, but they just don't generate the value that the fiber needs to do the forest management that's done in the forest. That's the differentiation mass timber has for us, that hopefully there's going to be enough value in the end product and be able to have the trickle down effect allow us to do high quality forest management in the woods, utilizing small diameter timber and doing what the resource needs out there.
And I would think that the benefit for Stultz timber to have, a 108-year-old mill that's got a legacy of stewardship is that you guys can kind of get your groove on as far as, you'll have a very solid and dependable, right, supply chain, Pat. That's an amazing thing to have it under kind of one partnership like that, and especially in Montana. And of course, you're both going to generate, jobs, great jobs in an emerging industry. I think it's awesome. This probably feels like what you actually grew up with, Ilka. I mean, this is what they do, right? I mean, you probably saw signs of this when you were there.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak towards, the small diameter versus the big diameter. I just know that, and even the smallest pieces of woods, it always was very, very managed and pretty manicured. And Paul, you were saying that forestry has all these different products. And I can definitely relate back to that, because all the forests, I mean, they're always, recreational for everyone, since, I mean, it's just denser in Germany. So you use the woods to, go for walks and everything. At the same time, you can definitely see how it's managed on the side there, the big logs that are somehow ordered in a way that, I didn't know or didn't understand, but yeah, it's definitely, visible. I just kind of wanted to close the loop towards the carbon sequestration a little bit, because if you start really using those small diameter trees, and use it in high quality building materials, it's going to be the act of being sequestered is going to is extended, right? Because if you just use those small growth woods for paper products, the CO2 is going to be released much sooner than if you use it in high quality building materials. Is that correct?
That's the crux of the situation. And I think if you go back to thinking about the forests, you can't discount the fact, what happens if we don't do forest management? What happens if we don't go in and remove those trees and do the thinning? Because the forest is going to change. And out here in the West, what happens is we have large scale wildfires. And you think about the carbon impact of those trees being killed by a wildfire. You have the carbon, that's released by the fire itself, but then you have a bunch of dead trees that are going to fall down and rot. It's going to release carbon. If we could take a portion of those trees, put them into a durable wood product and sequester that carbon, that's great. But if we can avoid the type of fire behavior that's going to result in negative carbon impacts as well, it's kind of a double win, right? We're keeping our forests healthy. We've increased the rate of carbon uptake by those forests by thinning them and allowing them to grow faster. And we've avoided the natural method of forest fire and insect and disease outbreaks that would perpetuate the carbon cycle that way.
So I think we're going to probably have Pat back, and we're gonna do a segment on like future building systems, and then we can really see exactly what some of these really awesome solutions that Stoltz Timber and some of his European heroes, right, that have kind of led him on his trail. But that'll be awesome to be able to see what we can do now with a combination like FH Stoltz and Stoltz Timber. Ilka, what else? Is there anything else, or you think we should wrap up this first awesome combo?
I think we can wrap it up.
Hey. Hi, everybody. We're back. We actually never left. We were just watching TV for a little bit. So yeah, that was fun. We did that a couple weeks ago, and now it's awesome to have these guys back with us. And we have some questions that we want to just jump right into and address. So I have a first question from Stan Lukoff. How important is diversity of species when managing a forest, and how is that managed? Are there certain species that are better and optimal for building purposes? Paul, can you address that question?
Sure, I'd be glad to answer that question. So I'm going to speak a little bit regionally, because this question is probably answered differently across the United States in different regions. For example, in the Southeast, there'll be a different question than there is for Northwest Montana. But I'll answer from my perspective. And for our company, managing for diversity is the key forest management strategy. It allows us to be more resilient to the natural challenges we have in our forest. We manage for a diversity of tree species, a diversity of age classes, a diversity of stockings. And what that allows us to do is be more resilient to things like insect and disease outbreaks or wildfire. So, for example, our insects generally target 1 or 2 tree species at a time. And so if you had, a monoculture of, say, lodgepole pine, and we had a pine beetle outbreak, then the risk that particular stand from that is obviously greater than if you had a species mixture in there with some lodgepole pine, some alpine fir, grand fir, and Douglas fir. So likewise, older trees tend to be more susceptible to disease and insect outbreaks too. So if you can maintain a diversity of age classes, this helps bring some more durability to your management structure there. So it's certainly a key element of our sustainability profile in how we manage our lands. And I think that's pretty true across the lot, especially smaller private landowners. Now, obviously, you have some folks that manage plantation style forestry, and just the level of management is greater. And so they have other methods for minimizing the risk of maybe just growing 1 or 2 species in a plantation. And I really can't speak to that as well as some other folks that do that day and out might be. Certainly, each tree species has different mechanical properties when it comes to its final use as a wood product there. And so it really goes back to balance between maximizing, the value of each individual species with minimizing the risks that come along with managing for a monoculture. Hope that answers this question.
Thank you.
So I have a question here too from Jonathan Gale. I think it's followed towards Pat. How benign are the glues used in mass timber, and do they off-gas?
Pat is muted. For some reason, Pat's muted.
Here, just a sec.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So the typical glues used in mass timber production have been developed primarily in Europe for the most part, where the air quality standards are quite high, both indoor air quality and exterior air quality. And most of the glues are heading in the directions of either melamine-based glues or polyurethane-based glues. And the general principle behind the glues that are utilized in these panels, because these panels form the structural pieces of our building and the aesthetic pieces of our building. So it's obviously incredibly critical that the measured air quality on inside of the building is healthy for the individuals, that it's not off-gassing. The primary concerns are high volatile organic compounds, and the glues that are developed there are designed to not off-gas. The two kind of primary things that sort of scare people are formaldehyde off-gassing and ureas. And the amount of formaldehyde that off-gasses out of the timber products is actually higher coming from the wood than it is from the glue itself. So the wood itself will naturally off-gas a little bit of formaldehyde on its own as a natural wood product. And when we measure the off-gassing between the wood and the glue, the wood actually off-gasses slightly higher, but is still non-toxic to the occupants of the building.
Hey Pat, when you guys are in production and you're looking at glues and specifying glues, are you going to be able to deliver like a zero VOC and still get the same adhesion and strength characteristics that you would, or do you have to make sacrifices and change your process?
The qualities of the glues have evolved so much over say the last 10 or 15 years that they've really figured out how to balance both. The strength of the glue has gotten considerably better over time, and also the amount of emissions has gone down. So they've really done an amazing job of balancing both of those at the same time.
Okay. So we have two questions from two future guests we're really excited about. Chris Magwood and Jacob Repson are on, and they're going to be on a HolzChat sometime this summer. We're really excited about that. And they both threw questions. I don't know if they're up for it, but it would be awesome if David could unmute Chris and Jacob, and let's just see if they can speak to us about their questions. Chris?
Yep. Am I coming through?
You are. Hey, how are you?
Good, thanks. Good, thanks. Yeah, I really want to thank you guys for this conversation. It's been really great and helpful. And I hope my question isn't. I'm not trying to take anybody to task in any way. I'm just really curious. I've been doing a lot of work trying to quantify both carbon emissions from building materials, but also carbon storage in building materials. And, it's been really tricky to figure out wood, and some of what's been talked about already here. It sort of brings up those issues, but I don't know if you guys have any answers. But, when you think of, the sort of simple math would be, if there's X numbers of kilograms of carbon stored in a slab of CLT, that's the carbon storage that material offers. But, as the conversation talked about, parts of the tree, being used for combustion, like there's a bunch of the tree that does not make it into that wood product. And so, just to make the math really simple, if half the tree, that carbon goes back to the atmosphere in the form of combustion or ends up on the forest floor or whatever, and half of it makes it into the wood product, then really no net carbon has been stored. The amount that's been emitted, has sort of subtracted the amount that's been stored. In other words, if you just left the tree, there would be 100% of that carbon in the forest. And also just, wondering about whether the certification programs, if anybody's measuring things like, soil carbon pre and post harvesting. And also, the time, there was talk about the tree sort of getting to the end of its life and then being harvested. But I'm assuming mostly the trees get harvested long before the end of their natural life, in which case that tree potentially could have gone on, storing more carbon than when it was cut. And so there seems to be all these factors that weigh in, and you probably don't have specific answers, but I'm just wondering, is that a conversation that's going on, or can you direct me to resources where people are kind of debating that? Because it seems like there are so many factors at play, more so than just there's X amount of carbon in this 2x4, therefore it stores that much carbon.
Can I take this one, guys? So I am really glad that you asked those questions, and we have been thinking, actually Ilka and I have been thinking about those. We did a presentation inspired by some of your presentations for FIAS, and what we did is we used the Tally software to do life cycle analysis. I mean, on a really kind of large view level, but even in the Tally software, and I know there's new software coming online, they're definitely looking, when they're giving you your credit for carbon sequestration for wood products and other categories that fall into that, they do build into the life cycle analysis for the biogenic. Basically, you get your biogenic impact. And so when you pull that lever on that life cycle analysis, it does definitely build in decomposition. It definitely has sort of a factor for combustion. If you're looking specifically about like what Pat and Paul are doing, when they're talking about fueling and heating their factory and their spaces, I think that right now, I think it's new. I think it's not nuanced at all in some of the life cycle analysis software. I think it needs to catch up a bit. But the great thing is that like people like you, I mean, through some of the work you guys are doing, some of the software that's already online and some of the software that's coming out, I think it can enable people like Paul that are, that want to do the right thing, but really don't have the tools to really kind of do a serious carbon study of their product, and also for Stoltz. One last thing I was going to answer about your certification question is, I don't think, I mean, I've been dealing with FSC timbers for like 15, 20 years. And I'm quite sure that all of these certifications that are great ways to sort of judge and vet the stewardship of the product through that life cycle chain, or the chain of custody, those guidelines. I'm quite sure that has not been updated really, to catch up with a lot of the new embodied carbon perspectives. What do you think about that? Chris?
Oh, back to me. Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't have. I'm looking for answers. I certainly don't have them. But and it's not that I don't think that there is great value in the way wood is being used, and especially the way these guys are talking about it. But I just it tends to be, and I especially see this from the wood industry, treated in this very simplistic way that, if you use a ton of wood, there's, X amount of carbon in that wood, and then you therefore sort of like take credit for storing that much carbon. And it to me, it sort of ignores, the vast complexity of what the real carbon cycle is in the forest during harvest, the point in time in which the tree was harvested. Like there's so many factors that go into that. And I just,
I totally agree. Yeah. I mean, I think that what the tools are trying to do, and hopefully these tools are catching up, is they first need to figure out what are these sources of positive and negative carbon on, a particular sourcing and also end production. And once these tools can do that, then I wonder if we could come up with sort of like a safe factor. So if you have so many tons of carbon that are related to a product, that you are making sure that all of the negatives are kept in check, so that you still have this very net positive effect. So I don't know if that's not really an answer, but I would love to get into that further with you guys when you come on, and we'll look into it a little bit more. I think that Jacob, actually, I don't know if Jacob's around. Jacob had kind of a similar question. Jacob, did you want to jump in on anything, or should we move up to somebody else? Can you unmute Jacob and see if he's around? Okay. So I see, how does the carbon footprint of harvesting, manufacturing, transportation timber compare to that of steel and concrete? Do we know how well timber performs after construction in respects to durability and maintenance compared to other building materials? Pat, I'm going to let you take that one.
Okay. Yeah, no,
Up a little bit more, Pat.
Important discussion. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just talk up a little bit. That's good.
How about now?
Yep.
Okay. So, you know, I think that it's somewhat of a design question. So in my personal experience, wood, when placed into buildings that are designed properly, meaning things like keeping the wood above certain height above the ground, creating, you know, overhangs that can protect the side of the building, using proper, you know, waterproof but breathable membranes where necessary to increase the longevity of the wood products. In that case, wood can last extreme long periods of time. I think one of the oldest wooden buildings in the world is in Nara, Japan. That's from around the year 1100. And in my tours around Europe, I saw buildings in the high alpine environments of the Alps that were from the 13 and 1400s and still had the original cladding on the exterior of the building. So it's not a question of can the wood last long periods of time, especially in relation to, you know, say other materials. It can, but certain, you know, design principles have to be followed to take that into account.
Okay.
Great. So there's a pretty interesting question asked by Vera, and her question is about the non-tree species. So how do you manage that? Do you think about those?
Sure, I'll take that one. So it kind of ties in with some of the other questions about the specific metrics of sustainability, and I certainly oversimplified the concept of sustainability of forest products, and there's a lot more that goes into it than just making sure that forests stay as forest, and that's really the role that forest certification plays is in filling out the answer to that question for the consumer. For example, just looking at the Sustainable Forestry Initiative Forest Management Standard, I mean, there's 16 different very specific objectives that are required to be measured and adhered to, that deal with everything from, you know, the mere concept of sustained yield calculation, making sure that you're not cutting more than you're growing. It covers water quality protections. What are you doing to ensure compliance with the Clean Water Act and considering, you know, different aquatic ecosystems that are potentially impacted by forest management. Wildlife is obviously a huge issue for us to continue to manage. And if it kind of goes back to the tree farm sign, where wood, water, wildlife, and recreation are all really important elements that are considered in our forest management. Those all tie into the definition of sustainability. And so as a forest manager, you know, we're not just looking at how do we maximize wood products. How do we maximize wood products in the context of maintaining a forest ecosystem that provides all the other benefits that society demands, quite honestly. And so you know, when it comes down to the definition of sustainability, there's a lot of different forest certifications out there. Quite honestly, a lot of states have forest management acts that are very prescriptive, that require regeneration within a certain period of time, are very prescriptive with protection of certain types of wildlife habitat and water resources. And so there's a lot of rules and regulations and certifications out there that deal with these other elements of forest management that are considered. And so that's all part of sustainability. It's kind of all what we do. And the nice part is that the role of certification is it can actually go through and verify that, yes, we are doing a good job out there. You can have, you can choose your certification that you put your trust in. But then they have very rigorous systems in place to ensure that the work getting on the ground is sustainable.
I think I have one more question, I think, because thanks everybody actually for staying on so long. I think we're going to do one more question I have from Jim Uhall for Pat. I think Pat's going to touch on this in the episode we do on future building systems, but I'll just throw this last part. Pat, in your experience with residential building with CLT in Montana, how do you see the residential market developing with the adoption of use of mass timber? So, you know, we know it's very popular and growing in commercial, multifamily, large, but I think the question is more about do you see it actually starting to happen in, you know, smaller residential projects? Your audio again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, just speak up a little bit.
Unmuted. Okay. So it's a great question. You know, I talk with my European colleagues quite regularly, 2 or 3 times a week. And, you know, that's one of the questions that comes up a lot is, obviously we all see the timber tower, you know, discussions, buildings that are, say, 18, 20, 24 stories high. That gets a lot of the press, the big press, you know, the big stuff in the news. But the reality is, in Europe, I would say that 75% of the market is still residential buildings. Residential buildings would be defined by both single-family residential and multifamily residential. And in Europe, it's definitely a mix of both of those. I couldn't say exactly how much, but we're seeing in our own experience that CLT and the associated mass timber products are very relevant and cost-effective, even in the single-family residential market. It's just a question of we do not have enough capacity right now in North America to keep up with the demand. And many of the producers are concentrating on larger projects that can, say, consume larger percentages of their factory capacity. It just makes sense, you know, take on several larger projects that can keep you busy rather than deal with maybe hundreds of individual single-family projects. But at the end of the day, from the factory standpoint, the machines don't really care whether it's cutting a panel for a timber tower, a multifamily building, multi-use building, or a residential building. So from a cost perspective, we can be competitive in any of those markets.
So, and I think it'll be exciting actually I'm really looking forward to the future building system episode, because we can actually talk a little bit about some of the stuff that Ilka and I are working with those guys on some projects. So I think I'm just looking to see, David wanted me, there was something that he wanted me to remind people of, and I don't remember what it was. I don't know.
So we'll be answering all remaining questions by email, and
that's what it was.
Yeah. Everyone's going to get a link to this recording.
Okay. I can't tell you all how happy we are that you came. Thank you so much. It was fun, and check us out next time. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.